Then on Sports Central, we go over our next schedule preview this offseason, and it's going to be over the Texas A&M Aggies, one of the teams that many are expecting to be a potential dark horse of the 2022 college football season, and rightfully so. Of course, you got a team that's got a lot of great returning production, the top recruiting class in the nation for the 2022 class, plus a couple of transfers, and this team is definitely built for a college football playoff run. But how will they be in 2022 is what we'll be going over here today. We'll be going over the players this team will be losing, who they'll be returning, and also looking at their schedule for the first time this offseason, starting out with some notable games from last season. And this team was 8-4 last year, so kind of a disappointing season for the Aggies, but obviously not a bad one. Getting up to 8 wins is something that I think a lot of teams would only wish they could accomplish. But of course, the Aggies, they did have their bowl game canceled as well, which is kind of a disappointment. They were supposed to play Wake Forest, but the game got canceled to COVID issues. But nonetheless, this team was 8-4 last season and third in the SEC West. I mean, this team down the stretch, they had some impressive games for sure. They did lose to Arkansas 10-20. Razorbacks were a good team last year, though. And of course, the signature win of the season, they knocked off the Crimson Tide, something that is extremely rare. And Texas A&M was unranked going into that game as well, which just makes it even more crazy. But they beat Alabama, number 1 team in the nation at the time, 41-38. They also beat Missouri 35-14. Good road win there against the Tigers. And they also beat Auburn 20-3. Lost to Ole Miss by 10, which was a tough loss to say the least there, going on the road. And they also lost to LSU to finish out the season 24-27, also on the road. So you can kind of see the theme here with Texas A&M. This is a football team that definitely had a lot of talent last year. I mean, they beat Alabama, which is an incredibly tough thing to do. But the Crimson Tide, of course, down the stretch also had some poor performances as well. So there were a few inconsistencies with this football team last season, there is no doubt. But looking at your roster preview going into next year, Zach Calzada has transferred to Auburn, so he obviously will not be with this team next season. But you got Max Johnson coming in from LSU, which I think is a great addition for the Aggies. Definitely, he's a quarterback that has shown a lot of promise and a lot of potential as well. So Max Johnson, of course, he played a good chunk of last season, started a good chunk of last season for the Tigers. So he definitely shows potential. I do think Max Johnson has got a higher ceiling versus Zach Calzada. So I would say this is a good addition and quite possibly an improvement as well for the Aggies. At the running back position, you got, of course, Isaiah Spiller taking off. He has put up 1,200 yards last season, 7 touchdowns. So that's going to be a tough loss. However, you do have some good depth in that backfield. You got Devin Ashane, of course, who's coming back. He put up 1,100 yards last season, 10 touchdowns as well. So he's an outstanding running back as well, and he was primarily behind Isaiah Spiller for a good chunk of last season, but it's going to be his time to shine come 2022. At the receiving position, Ainias Smith is coming back. That's going to be a big return. He put up 500 yards of receiving, 6 touchdowns. Jalen Preston also coming back, and Damas as well is coming back. So you got all 3 of your top receivers. You do lose your tight end, though, and Jalen Weidermeyer. He was a big impact on this team. He actually led this team in receiving last season, just barely over Smith. So Weidermeyer is going to be a tough loss for this offense, obviously. So that's kind of the main concern of this offense. I mean, the backfield looks good. I mean, Isaiah Spiller is obviously a tough loss, but they got some good depth there. And looking at the offensive line, you lose 2 there, 3 defensive linemen. So this defensive line is taking a couple of hits. You lose 1 linebacker and 1 in the secondary as well. So overall, I mean, defensively, you lose a couple of primary key starters for sure. But for Texas A&M, this is a football team that depth-wise really like where they're headed. And obviously recruiting, they're number 1 in the nation. We'll get into more about that in a second here. But potential dark horse for the 2022 season. I mean, this is a team that a lot of analysts are looking at in 2022 as a potential dark horse playoff contender. And I think that's very reasonable. I mean, this is a football team that definitely shows a tremendous amount of potential going into next season. And I really like the addition of Max Johnson as well. I mean, if they still had Zach Calzada for next season, their ceiling would probably be a bit lower. So I do think having Max Johnson as your quarterback versus Calzada does raise the ceiling a bit for the Aggies going into next season. Looking at your transfer portal and recruiting, this team has lost a couple of key starters, and obviously recapping the quarterback situation, Zach Calzada to Auburn, Max Johnson into Texas A&M from LSU. And they do have a couple of tough losses otherwise in the transfer portal. You don't really gain any key impact player except for Max Johnson in the transfer portal as of right now, but obviously that could change over the course of the offseason. This is still being recorded fairly early on in the offseason. Drayden Norwood's going to Missouri, DeAndre Jackson going to Nebraska, Darvon Hubbard is going to Temple, and Orebo's going to SIU. So that's what it looks like right now for the transfer portal for this team. But recruiting-wise, that's the big storyline. This team is number 1 in the nation for recruiting, and obviously that puts you at number 1 in the SEC. So definitely a great sign of the future for this Aggie football team. You got 7 5-star recruits coming in, most in the nation, then 19 4-star recruits as well. So recruiting-wise, this team looks fantastic going into next season. But that said, let's look at your schedule going into next season. Of course, you start off the year against Sam Houston on September 3rd. Then App State comes to town in week 2. You got Miami coming to town on the 17th. So that's kind of your big non-conference game for next season. But then again, Miami is kind of going into a rebuilding phase, so I'm not too terribly concerned about them. And then you got Arkansas in a neutral location on the 24th. And then in October, you got Mississippi State on the road, Alabama on the road as well. So you play the Crimson Tide in Tuscaloosa this year. You got your bye week and then South Carolina on the road after that. So 3 straight road games for this Aggie football team. So, I mean, you play a home game on the 17th and you don't play another home game until the 29th of October against Ole Miss. So you won't have a home game for about a month and a half and through your season. And then you play Florida, of course, at home after that, Auburn on the road, and then UMass and LSU to finish out the season. Looking at your first 6 games going into next year, Sam Houston, App State, and Miami, all easy wins, I do think, for the Aggies. Miami potentially is going to be the closest of those 3, but I'm not too terribly concerned about the Hurricanes once again. They're taking a lot of tough losses, and plus, I mean, I could easily see that team going into a rebuilding phase next season. So then you got Arkansas in a neutral location. Arkansas is going to be good, so got to keep an eye on them. But I do favor the Aggies against Arkansas and Mississippi State on the road for right now. That Alabama game is a tough one to predict. I mean, the Crimson Tide are looking great going into next season. I do think Crimson Tide are potentially a major national contender and potentially your national favorite going into next season. So I'm going to favor the Crimson Tide in that game, especially with it being on the road. And then you got South Carolina, of course, on the road in your second half of your season. That's going to be close as well. Spencer Rattler's definitely a player to keep an eye on. I mean, South Carolina in general is a team that's got a lot of great returning production going into next season. So, and I mean, when you add Spencer Rattler and a great tight end to the mix, Gamecocks could be a team to keep an eye on. But I do favor the Aggies in that game, and I also favor them against Ole Miss, Florida, and Auburn. Auburn on the road, potentially a tougher one, but the Tigers, I don't know about Auburn going into next season. Ole Miss and Florida both being home games, so I'm going to favor the Aggies there. Obviously, the Aggies have a massive home field advantage, so I mean that's definitely going to help them in their home games, obviously. And then you got UMass, that's going to be an easy win. And then LSU, I'm going to put that in yellow for now, but I'm still going to favor the Aggies definitely. That game is probably closer to 80% chance of the Aggies winning it, but once again, with it being a rivalry game, going to keep it as a closer one for now. But LSU, I mean, that's a team that just won a national title only 2 seasons ago, and here they are going into a rebuilding phase only a couple years later. So kind of an interesting situation for them. But for the Aggies, 9-3 to 11-1 is my predicted record. I do think this team is a definite national contender. I do think this team does take one loss at least down the stretch, whether that's to Alabama or some other team they slip up to. I do think this team will take a loss. So they won't go undefeated next season, I don't think. But this team is definitely going to have a great season coming up here. I would be very surprised if this team was a bust and didn't do very well. I mean, they got all the keys to success. They got a good quarterback coming in. Transfers look good. Recruiting looks fantastic. And returning production as well looks really good. So I really like Texas A&M going to next season. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below on the Aggies. And I appreciate you guys all watching as always. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Catch you on the next one.